I think there are a lot of composers that I really enjoy playing, and there are composers that I really admire. I don't just like Britten, I love Britten.
Hi there. Thanks for tuning in to Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, the podcast where you learn about the incredible world of string quartet music through the perspective of violinists Dale Barltrop and Francesca Hiew, violist Chris Cartlidge, and cellist Michael Dahlenburg. My name is Sam Jozeps, your host for this series. I'm so happy to share this episode with you. It's about one of my favourite string quartets of all time, Benjamin Britten's String Quartet No.2 in C major, Opus 36. Before we get stuck into it, here's a quick overview of Benjamin Britten. Britten was a 20th century British composer, conductor and pianist. He lived from 1913 to 1976. He is perhaps most notable for his operas, of which he wrote around 15, including one of his most famous works, Peter Grimes, and choral works, including his War Requiem. Britten also wrote pieces for orchestra, chamber ensembles, piano, soloists, film, and more. Benjamin Britten studied music with John Ireland, Ralph Vaughan Williams, and later Frank Bridge, and along with his live partner Peter Pears, embarked on many musical projects, not just in composition, but also in establishing new music festivals and infrastructure. Britten is known as being a passionate, values-driven person. I perceive him to have been a progressive thinker for his time, living in what was a conservative society. As a conscientious objector to military service, he felt compelled to stand up for his beliefs and put himself on the line publicly. I'm interested to know more about how he used music as a way of expressing his experience of the world and the feelings that drove him. For now, I'll leave it up to the musicians of the Australian String Quartet to chat about their impressions of Benjamin Britten and his String Quartet No.2.
My name is Dale Barltrop.
My name's Francesca Hiew.
My name is Chris Cartlidge.
And I'm Michael Dahlenburg from the Australian String Quartet.
I hope you enjoy.
Benjamin Britten is one of my favourite composers. He was one of the great English composers of the 20th century and had a huge output. He was just creating one original masterpiece after another. His music is extremely original and fresh.
There's an authenticity to his writing that is just so uniquely his. His sound is unlike anyone else.
But Benjamin was also, he was a sickly child and he struggled socially. He didn't have an easy childhood. And of course, throughout his whole life, he had to deal with being a homosexual in a very conservative society. He was a pacifist, very, very anti-war. Absolutely the most sensitive human being. So all of these elements play out in his music and give us this sense of who Benjamin Britten was.
He learnt composition when he was quite young from Frank Bridge, who was, one of his heroes, and he later studied with John Ireland and Arthur Benjamin and was very much sort of pushed to take on more of that sort of English pastoral style that was made so famous by Vaughan Williams and William Walton. This sort of more genial, beautiful style of composition. But I think it was really Frank Bridge who encouraged him to really find his own voice. He certainly did. I mean, you listen to anything by Benjamin Britten now and it is unmistakably him. There's a depth to his writing that is almost inexplicable. He has this understanding of sound and meaning, and he can translate that in such a unique way to the page.
It's just this world that he has created that no one else had. You know, he's sitting in with this historical lineage of English composers writing in a certain way. And he carves out something for himself. A voice that no one's ever heard before. It's not different for difference sake, it's just not someone else's voice. Distinct in such a stark way, like when you listen to Shostakovich, you know you're listening to Shostakovich. Or if you listen to Sibelius, you know you're listening to Sibelius. You listen to Benjamin Britten, and even in his early 30s, he's created something that no one had created before. A world that before him didn't exist, and he's just created it and made it absolutely extraordinary.
I think there are a lot of composers that I really enjoy playing, and there are composers that I really admire. I don't just like Britten, I love Britten. I think he's so unique. I read this quote, I wish it was my quote, but it's not my quote. And it was that Britten works, and that's why it is. He's a melting pot of different things. He's brilliant at counterpoint and polyphony, and he's got one ear or an eye looking to the past. But then, you know, he's very modern. I hate to use the word, but it's timeless. Everything that he wrote has his oral fingerprints all over it. It's surprisingly tonal, and yet it doesn't sound predictable. And it has that edginess that contemporary music can often have without the clash of destroying harmony. And I think that is, not to be too dramatic, but I reckon that's genius.
Britten's second string quartet is probably his most played of the three. It is a very special quartet to me. It is, again, unlike any other work for string quartet that I've ever played.
Britten's String Quartet No.2 was composed in 1945, a pivotal year for Britain. Of course, it was the end of World War II, and he had just returned from essentially a concert tour with Yehudi Menuhin, the famous violinist of Germany. They played in 1 or 2 concentration camps. It was an experience that stayed with Britten forever. And in fact, he never spoke of his experience at the concentration camp until towards the end of his life. At which point he told his partner, Peter Pears, that it had affected every single thing that he wrote ever since. And so the String Quartet No.2 comes just after he returns from this experience. He was charged with writing a couple of works to celebrate the 250th anniversary of Henry Purcell, great English Baroque composer. And so this quartet was an homage to Purcell. And you can hear this influence throughout the whole piece, in its originality, in its, the exploration of harmony, and also in these forms, particularly the third movement.
I think for me, all of the things that I find interesting about this piece, I learnt after I'd fallen in love with it. I didn't know anything about, the connections with Henry Purcell, or I didn't know any of those things, just that this was a composer I loved, and that I actually don't know. I listened to it before we programmed it. Just walking the dog and put on a CD and it was like, wow, just transported into this world of like distinctly Britten sound. So yeah, and then all of the interesting things I found out later. The little quirky things, doffing his hat to Purcell in all sorts of fun and clever ways. But most importantly to me it's incredibly enjoyable to listen to.
So the first movement of the quartet opens with this rising tenth. An interval that is very hopeful. There is this sense of wonder, and it's quite extraordinary. And it's set over this pedal tone that the viola holds.
So a pedal tone is a sustained note that is typically played by a bass or lower voiced instrument, while other notes or melodies are played over the top.
I think one thing us violists love to claim a bit of ownership over Britten. His favourite instrument being the viola, and the beautiful, beautiful things that he wrote. Just his love of the instrument and the sound and the way it sits in whatever context is surrounding it is very, very clear.
And then the quartet continues to play for a while in unison, this theme. It creates this almost a sense that it's being sung by a chorus. It's like one organism.
It's just these tiny little things that give you this feeling of grounding and scope from the very beginning.
And then, of course, it breaks apart and becomes 4 individual voices. But then he brings it back together again. And the way he toys with the listener and their perception of what a quartet is really quite brilliant.
A lot can be learned from even viewing the score. I think it's so interesting. There are passages where there is one thread of a tapestry, or at least it seems like one thread. If you had a microscope, you look in and you realise that actually everybody's playing the same thread. And so there's this sort of collective weaving of sound. And so it sounds like one thing, like one idea. And then all of a sudden it just diverges into this incredible polyphony. So it creates this sense of magnitude that is so surprising, but it is so powerful. I imagine his epitaph is, this idea of the many becoming one. I mean, it's why his choral music is, and his operatic scores are just so powerful, because there's a powerful message in all of it.
The second movement is the shortest movement. It's only a couple of minutes long.
A very fast, very fleeting scherzo movement. It's over in a flash.
A scherzo movement, or short composition, is usually a faster-paced movement of a larger piece of music. It's quite lively and often features surprises in dynamic and arrangement. They can be pretty exciting.
It's very technically tricky. It's very textural. I love the way he puts the two players against the two players, and you sort of mimic the other two. You essentially don't necessarily know who's playing what. It's just, these four people who are swapping parts constantly.
Franny always describes it as a school of fish, where there's these ideas weaving in and out, and you're together and then you're apart, or you pick a different person, and then you come apart again, and then you're paired up with a different person.
There is this scurrying kind of ostinato figure.
An ostinato is a musical phrase or rhythm that is repeated many times throughout a piece of music. The kind of thing that'll get stuck in your head for days after a single listen.
Where the string players have to bounce their bow. It's a very tricky technique, actually, the bouncing their bow up and back, which is an interesting challenge, but it creates this wonderful sort of rippling effect under quite a punchy theme that is very almost boisterous, and then breaks away into all sorts of different little canonic treatments. So you hear us kind of echoing each other, but just off. It's an effect that I don't know has been achieved by another composer since.
The last movement is just a masterpiece of a movement. It's the longest movement by far. In fact, it's longer than the first two movements combined. This is the chaconne.
A chaconne is essentially a theme that is heard at the outset and then a set of variations. And in this case, it's 21 variations on that theme.
I mean, 21 variations of anything should be enough to bore you, and yet it is the most fascinating thing.
It is an extraordinary piece of architecture. The way he takes this very simple but powerful theme and then develops it and uses it in so many different ways and colours it in so many different ways to create this sense of journey.
To me, it's almost meditative. I go to another place when I hear this movement. It sort of brings you back into yourself a lot.
And at various key moments throughout the chaconne, we hear a cadenza.
So a cadenza is like a little flourishing of notes played by a lead instrument. It's often improvised and can be pretty flashy.
First in the cello, and then the viola, and then finally in the first violin. And each of those moments kind of marks a turning point in the work. And then finally we get to the very end, and Britten brings us back to the theme with the C major chord, the most basic chord that one can learn. No flats and no sharps. The purity, there's an openness of C major. And he gives us this chord 21 times. 21 reiterations of the C major chord, the effect of which is breathtaking.
The first that the whole quartet play together is followed by silence. As a listener, you don't realise until that point that you haven't heard silence for a good 20 minutes. And that feeling of silence is almost deafening. It's such a finality, this feeling of this movement is over, but at the same time, it could go on forever.
It actually leaves us feeling completely spent and completely emotionally consumed.
And it's so epic.
It is an amazing piece of music.
Yeah, as I think you can probably tell, it's a piece that we just love. I think the audience is sometimes left wondering whether or not to even clap. There is such an intensity to this whole work from the beginning to the end that never really lets go. He just basically holds you by the collar. And then suddenly it's over. And I think for a while, you're not even sure if it's really the end. And you have to take a moment to sort of realize that, wow, we have come to this conclusion. And yet, it gives you also this sense of looking for something more.
I guess like everything we do, there's something you want to convey. And with a piece that is so important to all of us, we desperately want the listener to feel the way that we feel when we listen to it. It's such a vast piece. It's very complicated.
For me, I think the real challenge behind this piece is that the writing is not necessarily the hardest individual thing I've ever played, but it is the writing and how it encompasses the four players. He uses the quartet in such a way that it is very much one instrument. That's the difficult thing about it, that you have to be so in sync with each other, both your use of bow, the feeling that you're playing. There's a lot of movement that's almost sort of choral.
I've probably listened to this piece, all different recordings, as many as I can find, as often as I can make the space in my life. I will love it more and more every time. And so it's very difficult because we feel a certain way with all of that combined experience and love that is compounded every time we do this, to try and convey that in one performance. It's like, well, it's not realistic to try and shove all of this love, but in a way that's what I want the listener to feel.
I think every time I've played this quartet, it's met with surprise at first. I mean, not many people know Benjamin Britten for his quartets. People feel often quite emotional and almost a bit speechless at the end.
It has such an impact. It's sort of a very fulfilling journey. It doesn't leave me ever feeling like I never wasted a moment of my time playing Like every moment counts. And I feel like as an audience member you have, or certainly from my experience from the stage, is that you have this connection with everybody all the way through.
It's a really powerful and poignant experience.
I guess I would love the audience to walk away from this with kind of a... I don't want to say anything about how I want people to feel. Obviously, we always want people to enjoy our performances. And if there's someone in the foyer that's coming to this concert, I don't need to say anything to them other than smile and say good day, because I know what's going to happen to them. And I know that this is brilliant and they cannot not feel that.
How do I expect people to react? That's a good question. I'm not sure. How I hope people react, maybe, is surprise. Because often, if you've never heard the piece before, much like everything in life, we make gross assumptions. Your life is defined by choices you've often already made. But I would hope that if you were a first-time listener, that you really lived and enjoyed that surprise moment. It speaks to you. It's not 20th century British music, and it's not a throwback piece to Purcell. It's not avant-garde and it's not classical. It's just Britten. And, much like we're all ourselves, I'm Michael, you're Sam. This piece is Britten. And I think if you're, listening to it for the first time, I'm almost envious, because you get to meet this sound that is so very unique. And just enjoy that.
So, what can be said of this stunning piece of music and the artist who wrote it? For me, as a starting point, I think it comes down to something that Dale mentions. Britten had a tough childhood and a tough life. He was battle-hardened, but it was sensitivity that fueled him. Musically, Michael alluded to Britten as a visionary, with an understanding, perhaps almost an empathy for the past, and a vision into what could make a better future. And using complex musical patterns like polyphony and counterpoint, juxtaposing them with constant grounding elements including pedal tone and repetition, Britten created musical worlds that were familiar yet completely unpredictable. At the same time as he put listeners at ease, he put them on edge. This was perhaps not dissimilar to how he felt as the person that he was, living in a society that he was accustomed to, but at the same time that he mightn't have felt completely accepted by. And perhaps, at the end of the day, this push and pull of familiar versus strange, struggle versus acceptance, polyphony versus constant, is how Britten managed to create a completely unique voice in the world of music, and to have it speak to people in ways that others couldn't. Thanks for listening to this podcast of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. Musical excerpts featured in this episode is Britten's opera Peter Grimes, Opus 33, Prologue Interlude, On the Beach by the Orchestra of the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, conducted by Sir Colin Davis, as well as Vaughan Williams' Symphony No. 3, a pastoral symphony, performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Bernard Haitink, and Henry Purcell's Sonata No. 1 in G minor Z791, performed by the Purcell Quartet, released in 1995. You also heard the Australian String Quartet performing Britten's String Quartet No. 2, which you can hear in full at asq.com.au. For every episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, we commission and feature an original piece of music by a contemporary artist, using samples from that episode's subject. This episode's sampler was created by Bob Jarvis. Bob creates interactive and temporal artworks that integrate music, animation, code and text. Learn more at asq.com.au/podcast. The theme music for this podcast was created by Ghana-based composer, producer and multi-instrumentalist Adam Page. This episode was recorded on Gadigal Country, Sydney, and produced and edited on Kaurna Country, South Australia at the University of Adelaide. Thanks for listening to this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. You can kind of consider this series as a podcast version of one of those coffee table compilation books. You know the ones, 50 films to see in your lifetime. It's like that, but for string quartets. Catch you next time.